Okay, thank you very much again, Matt, for having accepted the invitation graciously. And I have some introductory note about you, and then we can start with the questions. So Matthew Huber is professor of geography in the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs at Syracuse and frequent contributor to the socialist magazine Jacobin. His specialities, according to his webpage, university webpage, are Marxism, energy, and capitalism, climate politics, resource geography. He's author of Lifeblood, Oil, Freedom, and the Forces of Capital, 2013, as well as the book that we are going to focus on today, The Climate Change as a Class War Building Socialism on a Warming Planet, 2022. So Matt, my first question is especially in the beginning of the book, I had this feeling in the inception that have you written an apocalyptical book about climate? And if so, why should we write an apocalyptical book about climate and geography?
Do you say apocalyptical?
Right, yeah.
So like dealing with apocalypse?
Right. In the beginning, I
Yeah.
had this hunch that it is like a apocalyptical book. In the beginning of the book, I had this impression.
Well, what I try to say is that most books start apocalyptically. Most climate books sort of start with extremely scary images about, impending heat waves and superstorms and disastrous food shortages. And what I tried to say is that I don't want to start the book like that because that's kind of become a cliche in climate writing. And I wanted to just start with a more difficult question, which is essentially that we're losing the struggle to address this possibly apocalyptic problem of climate change, and that is a fundamentally kind of question of power and struggle, and we really need to scaring everyone with the apocalyptic language isn't going to necessarily solve the problem or build the kind of power we need to address it either. So I wanted to kind of cut straight to the chase and try to make the point that the book is really about how can we think about a different strategy to address this problem, and to think specifically about it as a problem of power and a specific form of power, class power over how we organize production of energy, which is really at the core of everything we produce. Oh boy. Hold on one sec. Yeah, I'm not hearing you anymore for some reason.
Do you hear me
there
now?
You are.
All
yes,
right,
there
okay,
you are.
Okay, sorry. So the kernel of the three-part book and the incisive explanations, I have to say, and the examples is that we are blaming something wrongly. The climate fight you contend is not a cultural struggle against those who consume the most carbon, be the rich or individuals or wealthy nations, but a class struggle against those who actually produce fossil fuels. The reason climate change has fallen short, according to you, and gone astray, is that we have been wrongly blaming consumers. Who should we blame then, Matt?
So yeah, typically, even from a left wing or even socialist perspective, when people say, who's to blame for climate crisis, they talk about rich consumers and rich people engaging in carbon intensive consumption behavior that could be driving a massive fuel inefficient vehicle, eating lots of meat, or flying in a private jet. And these are all consumption activities that rich people do with the money they have a lot of. They spend their money on these carbon intensive and behaviors, and we have this way of analyzing this through kind of carbon footprint analysis, where you can sort of look at someone's consumption behaviors and kind of add up how many emissions are embedded in all those consumption practices. And so that's just become the default way in which we analyze who's to blame, who's the cause of, who has the highest emissions. So the problem with that is that there's a number of problems. The first I like to point out is that whole idea of a individualized consumption-based carbon footprint where all responsibility is on the consumer. That idea was concocted by the fossil fuel industry itself. British Petroleum came up with the idea of a personal carbon footprint in 2004, and they have been quite keen to spread the narrative that all of us are individually responsible for emissions, and that they like that because it takes a lot of the attention off of them and their responsibility. The second problem is that you as a consumer are just one node or moment in a wider set of relationships that provisions that consumption. And so when you are driving a car, and a lot of other people provision that fuel and those materials to your car for profit, and they sold you those commodities for profit. And the sellers of the commodities deserve some responsibility as well. And the third problem is that we spend a lot of attention on how rich people spend their money in these carbon intensive consumption behaviors, but we don't pay any attention to how they generate their money as owners, investors, and other types of capitalists, if you will, or landlords, or people that basically own property or capital and generate returns from that ownership. That activity and that behavior could have a way more carbon impact than what they do in their consumption lives. So you could actually have like someone who's a CEO of a very carbon intensive chemical company who spends like 12 hours a day organizing a global network of chemical factories that emit millions of tons a year. But that person could actually be like a vegetarian and take public transit to work, and we in the carbon footprint would just not see their role as this titan of chemical capital, which has massive carbon impacts. So we really need to focus more, I think, less, sorry, we need to focus less on the rich being a problem as consumers, and more they're a problem as owners, as investors, and as profiteers, people that profit off the production of energy or carbon intensive forms of production like steel or cement or automobiles or aviation. These sets of owners are really the ones primarily benefiting from our fossil fuel based capitalist society. They're the ones reaping the massive monetary rewards. And so the other thing is there's quite a lot less of them than if we start just thinking it's this distributed responsibility to all these scattered, even middle upper class consumers. You're talking about millions of people, and it creates this narrative that everyone's sort of individually responsible. And when we direct attention towards the owners and the profiteers, it's a much smaller group of people, and it's perhaps not an easier political calculus, but it's at least a more simple political calculus that we need to really take on them. They are the cause of this problem. It's not us, it's them, right? And we need a mass movement to really erode their power, because they're really hell-bent on maintaining their investments in this kind of form, fossil fuel carbon-based forms of production. They want to maintain those investments for as long as humanly possible, and we have to figure out a way to stop them. And that's kind of the core of the struggle, I think.
Right, but in order to have this mass movement, especially because on surface at least, environmental concerns are disconnected from and often antagonistic to working class struggles, do we need to expand the definition of working class?
Yes. So one struggle we've had is that the environmental movement has been very effective at, well, not even always effective, but it's been characterized as very oppositional movement that's, in its more radical variants, often trying to block, pipelines or coal extraction mines, or coal-fired power plants, blocking trains that are carrying oil. And those types of actions actually do have an antagonistic relation with workers who depend on those industries and jobs. And there's become this narrative that there's this kind of jobs versus environment paradox or conflict or contradiction. And obviously a lot of unions that are in those industries are quite angry and hostile towards those environmentalists who are trying to block the industries that provide them livelihoods.
Mm.
So what I say, though, is that the working class, in a Marxist sense, is actually a mass. It's the mass majority of society. It's the majority of those of us that don't own capital or property to generate our livelihood. That all we really own to generate a livelihood is our labor power that we have to sell on a market for a wage or a salary or an income, and that again, that's another relation of ownership that we should focus on in terms of responsibility for climate change, and point out that if all you own is your labor power and you sell it to capital for wages, you don't really have a lot of power or control over how energy is produced or organized or distributed in society. You just don't have power.
Mm.
So what I try to point out is that in a Marxist sense, what defines this working class is that they've actually been physically separated from any means of production, particularly the land. And there's this long historical process of violently dispossessing the mass of people from land and the means of subsistence, so that they again are forced to, the only option they have to survive is to sell their labor power in the market. And so what I argue is that this kind of market dependence for the wider working class, I call it proletarian ecology.
Mm.
This is how the mass of the working class survives ecologically. In capitalism, they have to get money. They have to navigate a market that has, subject to these serious constraints. People feel like they don't have enough to afford rent, afford food. In our barbaric country, people don't have enough to afford healthcare. So this struggle to meet your basic needs characterizes the kind of working class struggle for ecological existence. And that is, I think, we don't often think of environmental politics as trying to provide more secure access to those basic ecological needs like food and housing and energy. But those are precisely the sectors that we need to rapidly decarbonize to solve climate change.
Mm.
And so if we want to kind of build a more working class type climate politics, we should try to think about tying decarbonization of those sectors to more secure and cheaper access to those goods like food and energy and housing. And too often, I think climate policy sort of does the opposite, where they say, we're going to make energy costs more by putting a carbon price or something like that. So that's kind of, and I think because the mass of the working class, they all rely on those things, there would be more capacity to get a lot more people on board with that kind of program than the kind of traditional oppositional blocking industrial production approach, which of course is needed in certain contexts, but is not enough to kind of stitch together a broad mass-based working class movement.
Mm. But you've specified a whole part of the book. I mean, like almost 40, 50 pages to the professional class. Some of them might even happen to read the book.
Yeah.
So who are the professional and managerial class, PMC as abbreviated, climate activists, and what's wrong with them, or what do they do actually?
There's nothing wrong with them per se. I think I should have said this more clearly in the book, that all like powerful left-wing or socialist movements in history, or other types of movements, have always had layers of professionals, of intellectuals, of highly educated party leaders, whatever it is. And those have been crucial to those movements. The problem with the kind of version that I review of the climate professional class is that I argue they espouse a politics that is quite antagonistic to the wider working class. But taking a step back, in many ways, a lot of Marxists would argue that these professionals are working class because they basically need to sell their labor for a wage to survive. That what I argue is that whether or not you want to call them a class or not, they kind of create these distinctions from the working class by using credentials whether that be degrees or licenses or other types of accreditation or other types of skills, to carve out advantages in the labor market that give them that at least attempt to give them a advantage where they can cobble together a sort of middle class or comfortable material existence. And so this is kind of the class project of a professional class, is to use credentials to obtain this kind of material comfort. And so what I argue in a basic sense, there's two kind of main problems with the way in which they see climate politics. The first is that they really focus a lot as if it's a struggle over knowledge and belief or denial in the science, which of course is for good reason. We don't really understand climate change outside of the scientific methods of ascertaining it. But it's really weird in many ways because, as I was saying before, climate change is such a material problem. It's about industrial production, how we produce energy. It's about biogeochemical processes in the atmosphere. And it's almost like the professional class has turned it into a struggle over ideas, right? Over an idealist struggle. And this struggle over belief or denial in the science, I think, really resonates with a class of people whose whole class project is, again, about using credentials, often that have to do with education and knowledge acquisition. They are often themselves knowledge workers, right? So this idea that, smart, educated people understand the science, and it's these sort of masses of ignorant people who don't, is part of sort of what defines. And then more importantly, they will point out how powerful people in the fossil fuel industry and politicians are actively denying the science and sort of keeping the truth from the masses. And there's, of course, that's a real big problem in my country. Like a third of my country denies that climate change is even happening. So, but what I argue is that, again, by making politics all about knowing the truth and believing the science, you are espousing a politics that does not really resonate or really matter much to the broader working class, who's really struggling on an everyday basis to kind of meet their basic needs, to pay rent, to get to work, and these kind of basic, more everyday needs. When the Macron passed a fuel tax in France and a carbon tax of a sort, the Yellow Vest or Gilets Jaunes revolt had this pretty great line where they said, politicians want us to care about the end of the world, but we just care about the end of the month, right? So this kind of disconnect, where a lot of climate activists are talking about this kind of existential scientific problem that does appear abstract to most people. Most people only see what's in front of them. And I don't want to be misunderstood. Like, I think a lot of working class people do understand the climate science, do understand there's a big problem, but it's still not it's not an immediate problem like paying your rent is, or paying your grocery bill, or paying your utility bill, as I know you all in Europe are really thinking about right now. So that is, it's an abstract and politics of knowledge and education that really doesn't have much potential to resonate with the wider masses. Now, the second thing is, because their class project is so wrapped up in trying to create this kind of middle class existence of comfort, they also tend to construct a climate politics that's rooted in what I call carbon guilt, where they are so sort of focused on their own embeddedness in these carbon intensive consumption behaviors, whether it be flying or driving cars or using air conditioning or whatever it might be, that they sort of buy into this idea that it's actually these consumption behaviors that are really the cause of the climate crisis, and then that if there's a polluter elite that's driving climate change, it's the rich consumers, the elite consumers, and then they say it's people like me and us and people in academia, or people in the media, or people obviously more rich people in finance and stuff. And it's this broad set of consumers. And so that politics leads into what I call a politics of less, where the overarching focus is on the need for scale, like consuming less, and scale back and reduction of energy use, particularly in rich countries, and degrowth. And this kind of focus of that movement tends to focus a lot on less and reduction. And and that again, when you look at the wider context of capitalism for the last 4 or 5 decades, the wider working class has been living with less and austerity for several decades of this kind of neoliberal attack on the middle class and working classes. And people again are struggling to meet their struggling to kind of meet their basic needs, and that doesn't have much capacity to this politics of less also doesn't have much capacity to build that broad-based coalition.
Can we claim that as a result of, I mean, you're critical of this politics of less and this carbon guilt or carbon footprint policy, as you call it. I mean, don't you think that you're actually also critical of this diffused and scattered understanding of power among individuals, which had been common since 60s and 17?
Yeah, absolutely. And that theory of power is rooted in neoclassical economics and neoliberal ideology, which really suggests that who has the real power in a market economy? It's the consumer. It's the consumer who's free to choose, and it's the consumer who makes these choices in the market that really drives demand and really drives the market and all sorts of economic forces afterwards. So, neoclassical economics actually also, their theory of value is rooted in consumer preferences and consumer utility and consumer wants. And so this theory of, it's often called consumer sovereignty, that the consumer is the driver of the economy, is a theory of power. And it has this extremely distributed theory of power. That's just these scattered, decentralized consumers who are making choices in the market for exchange that are really driving production decisions, right? So, the big corporations that control production they're only responding to the choices and needs of these consumers who really have the power over what is demanded in the economy. Now, obviously, a Marxist has a much different view of power in the economy, and we tend to think that it's really, again, the people who own production and control production that really have the power, because they're the ones actually organizing and deciding how these systems operate and how production unfolds and how distribution takes place and who gets the wealth from production and how it's distributed and all this. So, we would argue that the power you have as a consumer in the market is only a power that's takes place after production's already been done and taken care of. And again, I would argue the climate crisis itself is fundamentally about revolutionizing how we produce energy and how our infrastructural production systems are organized. And those decisions are really not in the hands of sort of everyday working people and consumers. They're in the hands of a small set of owners and maybe even some state officials who kind of control and have all the power over deciding how those systems operate.
Right. And it means that in general, does it mean that like in a classical Marxist sense, you're actually criticizing a false consciousness in the climate crisis, where Marx's hidden abode of production has been ignored or overshadowed?
Yeah, so I have to admit, I like teaching Capital Volume 1 was big inspiration for the book and thinking about climate politics, because what Marx is trying to do in Volume 1 is he's trying to say that what classical political economy really celebrates about this new kind of market-based capitalist society, they celebrate the realm of exchange as this realm of freedom where two people can voluntarily choose to exchange goods and products, and that also in this realm of exchange that can sort of freely allow market buyers and sellers to kind of make these free choices. And as Adam Smith said, that like that will lead to a better outcome for society as a whole if we just let this market kind of work on its own through its free choices in buyers and sellers. And then what Marx does is he says, what if we look away from this moment of exchange and look towards what happens in that hidden abode of production? And there we see a much different story. There's not much freedom. It's capital dominating labor. And as he shows later, exploiting labor to create the profit or surplus value that gets harvested in exchange, or realized in exchange. And so this shift from exchange to production is a big part of Marx's class analysis and his I would say materialist focus, that we really need to look beyond this. He called it like the surface of everyday life, where you and I, like, that's all we see. We see consumption, we see exchange, we see these markets. We don't see the factory where the stuff we use is produced, because it's off limits, it's private property. So anyway, fast forward 150 years and we have this climate crisis. And if you listen to the media and policy technocrats and wonks, that they kept saying that, okay, this is a crisis of a market failure. That the problem is that the cost of, in exchange terms of emissions, are not being internalized into the market. And therefore the solution to climate change is about getting the prices right in the realm of exchange, about carbon pricing, about, through a carbon tax or through cap and trade schemes, you can kind of like internalize the cost of emissions into the market exchange mechanism, and that will smoothly guide investors and consumers to make all the right low carbon choices. And what that discourse did not really look at is, again, the same thing, the hidden abode of production, the fact that a huge bulk of emissions is coming from production, the fact that in the realm of production, you have capitalists who are narrowly focused on their own profits and generating returns for shareholders, and they have very little concern about their carbon footprint or about being good, virtuous, low carbon people. And that is actually, it's that realm of production that's really driving the crisis. And it's the power of those who control it over the climate that we need to actually confront.
Mm-hmm. I have a quote to you, like page 39. As is often said, climate change is an abstract problem. The weather is getting weirder and there is more and more news of disasters everywhere, but it's difficult to convince the vast majority of people that acting on climate is necessary now. End of quote. Matt, do you think, is the politics of fear and anxiety that you also address in the book, in climate politics and in media, the other side of the climate issue remaining something abstract?
Well, I actually think it might be a way that climate activists and climate aware communicators are trying to kind of overcome for the seemingly abstract nature of this. It's often thought of as this kind of looming or distant threat that is, and so to overcome that, communicators think we just need to scare the shit out of people, and really amplify the catastrophic consequences, which I should add are literally happening, they're ongoing. So you don't actually need to think about possible future catastrophic consequences. You just look almost any time of year, you can just look in the headlines. There's been some sort of unprecedented event that no one would predict would happen with much regularity, like the floods that happened in Pakistan. I remember maybe 10 years ago, there were catastrophic floods in Pakistan. And so the use of kind of fear of collapse, of species extinction and things, I think are a desperate attempt on the people that want to do something about climate change to say, this is really immediate, this is happening now, we got to act, listen to what the science is saying, we got to act. But again, I think this might not be true for much longer, but I think still most people don't have their lives upended by climate disasters. Most people, there's polling in the United States, I forget exactly, but they asked this really interesting question, which is not, do you believe in climate change, but do you believe it will impact you personally? And something like 53% if I recall. That might be wrong. But if I recall, something like 53% of Americans at least don't think it will impact them personally. You hear other stuff. Last year you heard 1/3 of people who had moved locations did so because some sort of climate-based disaster. So that's pretty stunning. But I still think a huge proportion of people they don't see the crisis in their everyday lives. They see it on TV, and it creates this kind of anxiety. But again, I don't think many social movements that have been successful in the past have really fear and anxiety as part of their, well, at least, you might say like right-wing fascist movements have kind of like a fear and anxiety. But I think on the left, like if we're thinking about massively powerful and successful social movements in history, it's not usually about fear and anxiety. It's about what you have to win and what you have to gain, and why it's important to fight for these like inspiring and historical improvements to people's lives that are really worth fighting for, right? And so I think we sometimes are lacking that kind of more inspirational, positive political vision about what we have to win. And just to mention it, that's what I did like about the discourse around the Green New Deal, because it was at least not focused on all the negative fear mongering and catastrophic imagery, but focused on, we're facing two crises right now. One is climate change. The other is just horrific Gilded Age inequality. And that to tackle both of these at the same time, we really have to confront the power of the rich, and we have to build a new society that would, value humans and the earth over profits, right? And building that new society, we can do things like offer free healthcare, offer more green public housing. We can offer cheaper or even free electricity as a human right. We can offer more free time, vacation time. It's a very positive vision of like material improvements to your life alongside decarbonization. Was one of the first times where you felt like climate politics was sort of steering away from the doom and gloom and the fear and anxiety messages, I think.
Again, I quote you: while most assume that political consciousness around climate will emerge from educating the public on the scientific reality of the dangers we face, or through experiencing climate disasters like flood, fires, and heat waves, my main contention is that neither of these can build a mass popular politics around the necessity of climate action. End of quote. Matt, do you think that you aimed to also communicate with the, let's say, working class who associate, let's say, at least towards the right wing?
Well, that's the problem, is that the working class is not pre-given in their politics, right? They're not automatically gonna be on the good side of political movements. And so one of the points I'm actually trying to make is that because the professional class form of climate politics is actively antagonistic to the larger working class, it's actually pushing them away to other political narratives on the right. Right? And you can actually see there's a lot of this kind of right-wing nationalist populist politics that literally just makes fun of environmentalism and calls it a liberal elite thing that happens on college campuses and isn't really about real working people, right? And so it's not it doesn't help when you have people like Macron and climate policy technocrats who are literally arguing for carbon taxes that will lead to higher energy cost. And that's not gonna win over those working masses, and they're going to be very they're going to be find it quite compelling when the right says these liberal environmentalists are trying to make your life cost more. They're trying to under the guise of some, again, somewhat abstract problem of climate change, they're trying to raise the price of energy, which you use every day and need in your life. And so we're just sort of playing into that trap where the right wing can just easily take advantage and win over a lot of working class people with a kind of anti-climate message. And that's exactly what happened, actually, when you looked at what Obama tried to do in the United States in 2009. He tried to pass this really technocratic market-based policy called a cap and trade policy. And it was about, again, making the emissions have value in the market. And essentially what the right did is they called it cap and tax. And they organized all these kind of, and eventually it became part of this Tea Party rebellion, this kind of somewhat, people would call it false grassroots, but there was like a grassroots populist sort of revolt against not just cap and trade, but other Obama programs like the affordable health care plan. And so that this sort of right-wing populist upsurge against carbon pricing really paved the way for Trump to even create a new kind of level of kind of right-wing working class nationalist populism that resonates. And of course, we're seeing this in Europe as well. More and more of, especially like the non-college educated working class, is moving towards the right. And the more affluent middle upper class college educated people are moving towards the center left parties that used to be parties of the working class. So this is a process that Thomas Piketty and others have called educational polarization. You're starting to see politics polarize around education as opposed to polarize around classes as it used to. So this is a real danger that if we aren't, again, actively trying to construct a working class climate politics, the right is sitting there and they're going to win over more and more working class people with whatever politics they have on offer.
Yeah, and the aim of the book is somehow the objective view of class. I mean, as a person who is not European, but like because of different reasons, including financial reasons, have decided to come to Europe to study and work here. It's becoming more visible, the relation between like environment, climate, politics, and situation and crisis and immigration. But like when we look at other subjective aspects of class, do you think that they are really less prior to this objective one? For example, can we expect a woman who is fighting now for her freedom in her country to have the same engagement in climate politics as a person who is living here?
Are you referring to the uprisings now in
Now, for
Iran?
example, the uprisings now in Iran.
Yeah, and I think, like that again is like it reminds me of the civil rights movement in our country, where it's something that was a form of power that oppressed people felt every day in their lives, and the domination of women. And I don't, I'm not expert on Iran, I don't want to, but the domination of women in many Islamic countries is an everyday form of domination, where the constraints on people's mobility and dress and cultural expression are constrained on a minute by minute basis. And it's similar, in the United States, the Jim Crow South placed strict, segregated forms of power on what African American people could or could not do in certain spaces. And it was humiliating and extremely demeaning and undignified, the types of power and oppression that were hung over these populations. So to me, again, so it's easy to understand how people would rise up and want to overthrow that kind of oppression, because it's so visible and so clear to see. And again, with climate change, it's not exactly, I think it's becoming more a visible and everyday thing for the people that, particularly like the youth right now, like the ones who organize like the student strikes, the Fridays for the Future. Like, I think people that are more aware about climate change are living this, like you said before, like this dread. People call it actually climate grief or climate dread. And they're living this kind of everyday anxiety about the collapse of our planetary systems. And so that is a sort of similar, I think. I haven't really thought about this. I'm definitely just talking off the top of my head. That's like a similar kind of everyday form of oppression that I think inspired what women are doing in Iran right now and what happened in the civil rights movement. Um, Again, though, I don't, the way in which the civil rights movement was able to win, though, was by inspiring the larger masses of the country to, and not all of them, right? There was a ton of opposition, but inspiring at least a mass movement to be on the side of the people fighting. And so that's the kind of challenge of how do you take individual and small scale feelings of oppression and injustice and translate them to a kind of mass politics.
Mhm.
And unfortunately, we don't have a ton of examples on the left of really figuring that out, how to translate small scale struggles into mass politics that really can build like substantial power over societal transformation.
And well, my last question is not that different from the previous one. On the climate action page of the United Nations about Iran, we read that, like all other countries, Iran must contribute to, as it is already affected by climate change. Geographically, Iran is in the dry belt of the world with high temperatures and relatively limited rain and snow. This makes water resources as one of the most important limiting factors in the development of the country. Iran's
Mm-hmm.
economy is affected in more ways by the consequences of the climate change. So end of that quote. How can, I mean, not really different from the last question, but how can climate politics consider Iranian working class who is suffering both from corruptions inside the regime and the sanctions, international sanctions outside?
Yeah, so there's like two things going on there. So there could be climatic conditions that could lead to drought or lack of water resources that could lead to really serious water shortages in Iran that would, I think, create a sort of societal uh, desire to kind of address that. But I think the point you bring up in terms of the sanctions and the more generalized economic suffering that's happening, I just finished a term as the director of the grad program here at Syracuse, and we actually had a lot of Iranian students who were trying to apply to our program and begging us to waive the application fee because they're really struggling with the sanctions and basically financially. My sense is that, again, that those economic struggles rooted in imperialism and geopolitics, but also I imagine rooted in unequal divisions of power and wealth in Iran itself, those class divisions. Those to address those is going to be much more immediate to the wider masses of Iran, to try to build more power for the working class and for the oppressed majority. I imagine lots of informal workers and other types of workers in Iran to actually like solve those problems of economic insecurity will have a lot more resonance and capacity to move people than the potential for drought or the potential of water shortages. Of course, until those climactic things lead to really a serious crisis in the moment.
Right. Perfect. Yeah, Matt, thank you very much.